The courtroom was small, with rows of wooden benches that creaked whenever someone shifted their weight. The air felt heavy with tension, as though everyone inside sensed that something unusual was about to happen. People whispered quietly among themselves, glancing at the front where the judge's bench sat raised, giving the courtroom an air of solemn authority. At the center of attention was a police officer, sitting on the witness stand, straight-backed and confident. He spoke with a tone that suggested he believed no one could challenge him. Every word he uttered seemed measured to impress or maybe to intimidate. At the other side of the courtroom, a woman sat calmly. She was dressed simply but with a quiet authority that made people notice her immediately. She didn't fidget or glance around nervously like some of the others. Instead, she held herself with a kind of quiet confidence. She had been preparing for this moment for a long time, and she was ready for whatever the officer would say. She knew the power of patience and precision, and she understood that the loudest voice in the room was not always the strongest. The officer began recounting the incident that had brought everyone to the courtroom that day. He described it as if it were simple and routine, almost mundane. But his words carried a tone of mockery, especially when he glanced at the woman. He made subtle jokes about her involvement, suggesting that she didn't understand the situation or was overstepping her bounds. There was a slight smirk on his face as he spoke, the kind of expression that made it clear he believed he was superior. People in the room shifted uneasily, sensing the unfairness, but the woman did not respond immediately. She remained composed, listening carefully, weighing each word. Some in the courtroom tried to hide their reactions, while others couldn't help but frown at the officer's attitude. It was clear that he underestimated her, assuming she was inexperienced or timid, but she had faced challenges before, and she had learned that composure could be more powerful than confrontation. She allowed him to speak, letting his arrogance show itself fully. Every smirk, every dismissive glance only reinforced her determination. She knew that reacting too early could give him an advantage, so she remained silent, letting the room witness the contrast between them. As the officer continued, he started to embellish the story, adding details that painted him as the hero of the incident. He spoke loudly, emphasizing his actions and making it clear that he expected everyone to be impressed. He glanced again at the woman, this time with a sharper edge to his mockery. "I'm sure she's not familiar with the process," he said, almost under his breath but loud enough for the court to hear. A few people chuckled nervously, unsure whether it was appropriate, while others simply shook their heads. The woman's eyes remained steady on him. She didn't flinch, didn't roll her eyes, didn't respond with anger. Instead, she made a note of his behavior in her mind, cataloging every subtle insult and misstep. The judge observed quietly, a silent authority over the proceedings. Judges often saw this kind of behavior, witnesses trying to assert dominance, attorneys or involved parties reacting defensively, but something in the air suggested that this situation was different. The woman did not fit the mold of someone who would be intimidated. She had a presence that commanded respect, and it was only a matter of time before it would become obvious to everyone in the room. The courtroom itself seemed to hold its breath as the officer continued. He described the events with more flair, his voice rising and falling as he added his own commentary. He laughed lightly at parts, clearly enjoying the attention, but every laugh, every exaggerated gesture, was another piece of evidence that he was underestimating her. The woman, meanwhile, made notes in her mind, preparing to respond not with anger or sarcasm, but with calm precision. She knew that real authority was quiet and firm, not loud and mocking. Some spectators shifted in their seats, leaning forward to catch every detail. There was a mix of curiosity and unease. People could feel the tension building, the subtle battle of confidence and credibility playing out before them. It was not a confrontation with raised voices yet, but the undercurrent was undeniable. Everyone could sense that the moment when the woman would respond was approaching, and that when it came, it would be decisive. The officer glanced down at some notes in front of him, smirking as if he had already won the unspoken contest of respect. "I don't think she really understands what happened that night," he said with a laugh that was meant to be light, but which carried an edge of contempt. It was the kind of comment meant to belittle without overt confrontation. But the woman's calm eyes met his, and for a brief moment the room felt a shift. Something about the way she looked at him suggested that she was not intimidated, and that she was more than ready to respond when the time was right. People began to notice the dynamic. even those who were unfamiliar with the details of the case. The contrast was striking. The officer, confident and mocking, and the woman, quiet but unyielding. It was the kind of situation where tension could be felt physically, like the air itself was heavier. The courtroom, which had been a simple room of procedure, now felt like the stage for a subtle but intense showdown. Even the court reporter, who had been typing mechanically, seemed to pause slightly, aware that something unusual was unfolding. The woman's calmness was not just passive. It was active, a deliberate display of control. She had faced similar situations before, but never in such a formal setting. Yet she understood that authority and credibility were built over moments like this, not demanded, and she had prepared herself meticulously to ensure that when she spoke, her words would carry weight. The officer, unaware of the shift, continued, emphasizing his version of events with gestures and occasional laughter. Each movement, each word was meant to assert dominance. But the woman did not flinch. Her posture remained straight, her hands resting lightly on the table in front of her. She made no sudden movements, no gestures that could be misconstrued. In her mind, she was cataloging everything: the tone of his voice, the rhythm of his speech, the subtle arrogance in his manner. All of it would serve her when she finally addressed the situation. As the minutes passed, it became clear to anyone paying attention that the courtroom's energy was subtly shifting. The audience, once neutral, began to sense that the balance of power might not be where they assumed. They noticed her calm demeanor, her confidence, and how it seemed to silently challenge the officer's authority. The contrast was stark, one person shouting and mocking, the other quietly observing, composed and ready. The judge finally cleared his throat, a gentle reminder of the order of the court, but even he seemed to sense the growing tension. The officer, still smiling, adjusted his notes, assuming he was in complete control. But the woman's silence was not submission, it was preparation. She was waiting for the right moment, knowing that the true power of her position would not come from words alone, but from timing, clarity, and authority. Outside, the sun shone brightly through the small courtroom windows, but inside the room felt suspended in anticipation. Every person, every gesture, every glance mattered. The officer's smirk began to waver slightly as he sensed, though could not yet identify, the shift in the room. The woman's calm was disarming, and the more he tried to assert himself, the more apparent it became that he was facing someone who would not be easily intimidated. The courtroom had become a subtle battlefield, with strategy and patience as the weapons. The officer believed he had the upper hand, that his mockery would unsettle her. But she was a master of quiet confidence, a person who understood that real authority was felt, not boasted. And as the tension built, everyone in the room sensed that something remarkable was about to happen. Something that would redefine the dynamics of power in that small courtroom. Even without raising her voice, the woman commanded attention. Her presence alone suggested competence, experience, and authority. The officer, for all his outward confidence, had misjudged her completely. And as he continued speaking, unaware of the storm he had provoked, the woman prepared to make a move that would leave the courtroom stunned. The stage was set, the audience waiting, and the moment of revelation was drawing near. The officer finished his statement with a confident flourish, expecting approval, or at least acceptance. But as he glanced at her again, he saw no sign of fear, no hint of submission. Instead, there was a steady gaze, calm and unwavering. In that look, he glimpsed the first sign that his mockery had failed. He could not yet understand what it meant, but the shift was undeniable. The room itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her to speak. And in that quiet tension, the true nature of the situation became clear. The woman had not been intimidated, had not been rattled, and had not been fooled by his arrogance. She had observed, analyzed, and prepared. And as the courtroom leaned forward in anticipation, it was evident that the next words spoken would not just answer the officer's mockery, they would change everything. The woman remained seated, her posture calm, her hands folded lightly on the table. She had spent years preparing for moments like this, where knowledge and composure mattered more than volume or bravado. The courtroom was still filled with people who were curious and cautious, trying to figure out what was about to happen next. The officer, on the other hand, had settled into a rhythm of self-assured speech, confident that he had already established control. He did not yet realize that his overconfidence was about to backfire. She waited, letting his words hang in the air. There was a certain strategy to her silence. She understood that rushing to respond to mockery could make her appear defensive, weak, or reactive. The courtroom was a stage, and she was aware of the impact of every small movement. Her gaze swept over the room, observing the faces of those present. Some were attentive, some skeptical, and some clearly surprised by her calm demeanor. She noted how the audience had shifted slightly, leaning forward as though sensing that the balance of authority was no longer one-sided. The officer began detailing his actions from the night in question, exaggerating certain points and downplaying others. He laughed lightly at moments that were meant to highlight his own cleverness, throwing in small jabs at the woman's supposed inexperience. "Of course, she probably doesn't know the protocols," he said, with a tone that was meant to dismiss and belittle at the same time. He assumed that everyone would take his words at face value. He assumed, too, that she would react with indignation or confusion. But he underestimated the quiet strength that she carried. She leaned slightly forward, just enough to show attentiveness, but not so much as to seem aggressive. In her mind, she was analyzing his every move. Every word he said, every gesture, every pause was a clue. She had learned that people who tried to dominate with arrogance often made mistakes when they believed no one was paying attention. She noticed the subtle inconsistencies in his statements, the small exaggerations, and the way he glanced around almost unconsciously to see if anyone else had caught them. The courtroom was silent for a moment as he recounted an interaction, claiming that she had misunderstood a situation entirely. His voice was steady, but there was a hint of strain, a slight tightness around his eyes that he tried to hide with a small smirk. That was the moment she chose to act, not with anger, not with confrontation, but with precise questions that revealed the gaps in his testimony. "Officer," she began, her voice calm and even, drawing everyone's attention without needing to raise it. "Can you clarify what time you arrived at the scene? And specifically, who directed you to take the actions you described?" Her tone was gentle but firm, the kind that demanded honesty without sounding accusatory. She asked the questions in a way that allowed the officer to answer freely, yet subtly forced him into a corner. The officer blinked, caught off guard. He had not expected questions so pointed and precise. I arrived shortly after the call came in," he stammered slightly, attempting to maintain composure. "And I followed standard procedure, of course." His voice had a hint of uncertainty now, though he tried to mask it with a small, forced smile. The woman continued, her questions building a clear pattern that exposed contradictions in his earlier statements. She asked about the sequence of events, the exact wording of instructions he had received, and the witnesses he claimed were present. Each question was deliberate, crafted to highlight inconsistencies while maintaining a tone of polite inquiry. The courtroom began to notice the shift. The officer's confident demeanor, which had seemed unshakable, now showed signs of strain. People began exchanging quiet glances. Some whispered softly, wondering why no one had challenged him before. Others leaned forward, intrigued by the calm, methodical approach the woman was taking. The energy in the room changed subtly. The officer's smirk, once a mark of dominance, began to falter. There was a tension in the air, a sense that the scales of credibility were slowly tipping in her favor. As she continued, she referenced legal procedures and protocols, not in a boastful way but with quiet authority. "According to the guidelines, any officer in your position must document the sequence of events immediately," she said, her tone even and matter-of-fact. "Can you show that this was done as described?" The question was simple, but it carried weight because it was precise and grounded in fact. The officer hesitated. He shuffled through his notes, attempting to find evidence to support his statements. There was a visible shift in his confidence. He had started the day believing he was untouchable, that no one could challenge him effectively. Now he realized that he was being scrutinized in a way he had not anticipated. He tried to respond with general statements, but her follow-up questions left little room for vague answers. The courtroom watched silently, captivated by the unfolding scene. There was no shouting, no dramatic gestures, only a quiet, powerful exchange of intellect and strategy. The woman's calm approach contrasted sharply with the officer's faltering confidence. She was methodical, patient, and deliberate. He was reactive, unprepared for the precision of her inquiry. Each moment added to the growing tension, making it clear that the balance of authority was shifting. She paused briefly, allowing a moment for her questions to sink in. Her eyes met the officer's, not with anger or hostility, but with steady resolve. It was a look that conveyed without words, that she was fully aware of his exaggerations and misstatements. The officer's eyes darted slightly, a flicker of realization crossing his face. He was beginning to understand that this was not a routine proceeding and that the woman across from him was not someone to dismiss lightly. She then addressed a specific point that had been a cornerstone of his testimony. You mentioned that you acted immediately based on instructions received. Can you provide the exact time and source of those instructions? The courtroom hung on his response. The officer's confident tone wavered as he realized that his recollection was unclear. He muttered something about recalling the details later, but it was obvious to everyone that he was struggling. The spectators in the courtroom began to murmur softly. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others whispered to their neighbors about the surprising turn of events. The woman's calm, logical approach had turned the tables without her ever raising her voice. People were beginning to see her as competent and commanding, someone who could stand firm even under direct mockery and intimidation. Even the judge leaned forward slightly, taking notice of the skill with which she handled the situation. The questions were not aggressive, but they were effective. The officer had relied on arrogance and assumption, but her methodical inquiry left him exposed. His earlier confidence, which had filled the room, was fading under the weight of precise questioning. She continued, carefully pointing out contradictions without attacking him personally. You stated earlier that the witness was present, yet your report indicates otherwise, she said calmly. Can you reconcile this discrepancy? Her tone remained measured, emphasizing clarity and truth rather than confrontation. The officer's response was hesitant, fumbling through explanations that seemed less convincing with each attempt. The courtroom sensed the subtle victory unfolding. It was not a dramatic shout or a heated argument, but a demonstration of quiet authority. People began to appreciate the power of preparation, patience, and calm reasoning. The officer, who had entered the room with a sense of superiority, was now visibly unsettled. His attempts to regain control were clumsy, as if he were trying to assert authority that had already slipped from his grasp. The woman's approach was a lesson in strategic communication. She understood that respect was earned through competence, not assumed through rank or position. Every question, every pause, every careful observation she made reinforced her authority. She did not need to raise her voice or confront him directly. The strength of her mind and the clarity of her reasoning spoke louder than any shout. As she continued to question, she also considered the audience. She was aware of how each person in the courtroom perceived the exchange. She knew that her calm demeanor, her precise inquiries, and her unwavering composure would leave a lasting impression. People were watching not just the officer, but her ability to navigate the situation with dignity and effectiveness. She understood the broader impact of her actions, not only on the immediate proceedings, but on the perception of fairness and authority in the courtroom. The officer's discomfort grew as the questions continued. He had relied on confidence and mockery to maintain control, but those tactics were failing. The woman's intelligence and preparation were exposing gaps in his narrative, and he had no choice but to answer truthfully. Every hesitant reply, every slight stumble, highlighted the growing shift in authority. The courtroom had become a silent observer to a transformation in power dynamics, one that was as subtle as it was profound. Finally, after several pointed questions, the officer paused, realizing that he could not respond effectively without admitting uncertainty. He had underestimated the woman completely, and the realization was both humbling and unsettling. She had turned his own assumptions against him, revealing flaws in his testimony while maintaining complete composure. The audience sensed that a decisive moment was approaching, though they could not yet predict its exact nature. The courtroom remained quiet, the tension thick but controlled. The woman had established herself as more than a participant. She had become the authority in the room. The officer, once confident and mocking, was now cautious, unsure of how to proceed. His earlier arrogance had dissolved under the weight of her steady, methodical questioning. Every person in the room recognized that this exchange was more than a confrontation. It was a demonstration of intelligence, preparation, and the quiet power of authority exercised correctly. Her calm authority had shifted the energy of the room completely. The officer could no longer rely on mockery or intimidation. He had to confront the truth, and that truth was that she was fully capable, fully prepared, and fully aware of every detail that mattered. She had observed, analyzed, and acted with precision, turning a situation that began with disrespect into one where she commanded respect effortlessly. Even as she prepared to move to the next phase of questioning, the courtroom felt the momentum. People leaned forward slightly, anticipating the next exchange. The officer's earlier dominance was gone, replaced by careful calculation and growing apprehension. She had not yet revealed everything, but the shift was undeniable. The stage was set for the moment that would leave the courtroom stunned, and everyone sensed that it was coming soon. The courtroom had grown quieter now, the murmurs fading into a tense silence. Everyone present seemed to sense that something significant was about to happen. The woman remained seated, composed and calm, her hands resting lightly on the table in front of her. Her eyes, steady and focused, were fixed on the officer who sat across from her. For a moment it felt as though time itself had slowed. The officer, once brimming with confidence and mockery, now fidgeted subtly, trying to regain his composure but failing. She had been patient up until now, letting him reveal the weaknesses in his testimony with every word he spoke. Her approach had been methodical, calm and deliberate, forcing him to stumble without raising her voice or showing irritation. She had proven to everyone watching that she was not intimidated, that she had the skills and knowledge to question effectively, and that she could expose contradictions while remaining dignified. The tension in the room was palpable, as if everyone could feel the officer's control slipping away with each passing minute. Finally, she leaned forward slightly, a small, almost imperceptible movement, and spoke. "Officer," she said, her voice steady and calm, "I believe there is a misunderstanding here. Perhaps you are not aware of my role." Her words were simple, almost conversational, but the way she said them carried authority. The courtroom seemed to lean in, every ear straining to catch what she would say next. The officer tilted his head, curious, and a faint smirk returned to his face, assuming she was about to acknowledge his points politely before moving on. She paused for just a moment, long enough for the silence to grow thick with anticipation. Then she said clearly and firmly, "I'm the Attorney General." The room seemed to stop breathing. The words echoed in the space, simple yet powerful. The officer froze completely, his mouth slightly open, unable to speak. The confidence that had radiated from him moments ago vanished instantly. His eyes widened, and his hands trembled just a little as they rested on his notes. It was the first time anyone in the courtroom had seen him truly unsettled. The woman's calm authority had completely disarmed him, and now, with her title revealed, there was no way for him to assert dominance again. The spectators, once quietly observing, now reacted with audible surprise. Some gasped softly, while others leaned forward in disbelief. Whispers spread through the room, people exchanging stunned glances as the gravity of her statement sank in. The officer who had mocked her just moments ago could do nothing but stare. He had assumed she was inexperienced, that she would be intimidated, and that her presence was insignificant. He had been entirely wrong. The woman remained calm, unshaken by the sudden shift in attention. Her voice did not rise, her demeanor did not change. She had achieved exactly what she intended. She had established control over the courtroom and exposed the arrogance of someone who underestimated her. Her quiet authority now filled the room, and everyone could sense it. Even the judge, who had watched the proceedings with measured attention, leaned forward slightly, acknowledging the power of her presence without a word. The officer tried to recover, clearing his throat and glancing at his notes. He wanted to respond, to regain some semblance of authority, but he struggled to find words that could match the sudden weight of her revelation. Every attempt came out awkward, halting, and unconvincing. The courtroom, sensing his hesitation, fell into a deeper silence, as if waiting to see whether he could redeem himself or whether the moment had completely shifted beyond him. People began to notice small details that had gone previously unremarked. The woman's calm posture, the clarity of her voice, the precision of her questions, these were not merely qualities of competence. They were indicators of someone who commanded respect naturally, someone whose authority did not rely on aggression or intimidation. The officer, on the other hand, had relied entirely on bluster and mockery, and the contrast could not have been more obvious. Some spectators exchanged whispers. "She's the Attorney General?" one asked softly, disbelief in their tone. "I can't believe he didn't realize," replied another. The whispers spread slowly, the realization sinking in that the officer had misjudged the situation completely. For a moment, the courtroom was captivated by the drama unfolding, not a loud, violent drama, but a subtle, intellectual one, where composure and precision triumphed over arrogance and mockery. The officer, finally attempting to speak, stammered slightly. I wasn't aware." His voice faltered, and he cleared his throat again. The words were feeble, incapable of regaining control. The woman, meanwhile, did not need to respond aggressively. Her presence alone conveyed authority, her confidence filling every corner of the room. She had exposed not just his arrogance, but the danger of assuming superiority based on rank or appearance. The judge called for order, but even his voice could not mask the shift in attention. The courtroom was united in its focus, all eyes drawn to the woman, to the way she had calmly taken control. It was a lesson in authority, respect, and preparation. She had demonstrated that true power did not require loud words or forceful gestures. It required knowledge, patience, and the courage to stand firm in the face of disrespect. The officer's hands shook slightly as he adjusted his papers, trying to regain composure. He was aware now that every word he said would be scrutinized, that any further attempt at mockery or arrogance would be immediately exposed. The realization was humbling, even frightening. He had entered the courtroom expecting to dominate, and instead, he had been completely disarmed. His own assumptions had worked against him, and he could do nothing to reverse the situation. Meanwhile, the woman continued her questioning, now with a subtle but unmistakable authority. Her questions were no longer just about the details of the incident. They now carried the weight of her position. Every inquiry, every request for clarification, reminded the officer and the courtroom of her authority. She did not need to raise her voice or show frustration. The knowledge that she was the Attorney General, combined with her calm intelligence, was enough to command respect effortlessly. The audience watched as the officer struggled to answer her questions. He had previously relied on confidence and assumed knowledge to assert control. Now, under her steady gaze, he found himself exposed. His answers were tentative, cautious, and at times contradictory. The courtroom, sensing the truth, responded with subtle reactions, raised eyebrows, soft murmurs, and occasional nods of acknowledgement for her precision. It became clear that her strategy had worked perfectly. She had not needed confrontation, aggression, or insult to establish authority. Her patience, preparation, and careful questioning had revealed his weaknesses naturally. The officer, who had entered the courtroom believing he was untouchable, was now trapped in a situation where honesty and careful thought were his only options. Every attempt at deflection or bluffing failed, and he knew it. The woman then made a statement that was calm yet firm, reinforcing her authority. "It is important that we are clear on the facts," she said. "We must ensure that the testimony is accurate and consistent. Please take a moment to review your notes and clarify any discrepancies." Her words were polite but commanding, a reminder that the focus was on truth, not ego. The officer, aware that he could not avoid scrutiny, nodded slightly and began to review his notes with visible tension. The courtroom responded to her calm authority. There were no dramatic outbursts, no cheering, just a collective awareness of the shift in power. People felt the significance of the moment. They realized that arrogance and mockery could be dismantled not with equal aggression, but with quiet competence and steady confidence. It was a lesson in humility for the officer, and an example of leadership for everyone watching. As the officer struggled to reconcile his testimony, the woman remained composed, observing him carefully. She noted his hesitations, his small gestures, the subtle signs of stress. She continued to ask clear, precise questions, making it impossible for him to avoid addressing inconsistencies. Every response he gave now carried a trace of caution, a reminder of how completely the dynamic had changed. The judge, observing quietly, recognized the remarkable display of control. The woman had not only revealed her authority, but had also turned what could have been a confrontational situation into a demonstration of methodical intelligence and poise. The courtroom, previously focused on the officer's supposed dominance, now focused on her calm, precise, and commanding presence. The officer's earlier mockery had evaporated, replaced by nervous attempts to justify his statements. Each word he spoke was carefully measured, knowing that any slip could further expose him. Meanwhile, the woman's quiet observation and strategic questioning ensured that the truth remained central, and that her authority was never in doubt. By the time she paused for a moment to let the court absorb the situation, It was clear to everyone that she had changed the energy of the room entirely. The officer who had once seemed untouchable was now clearly aware of the magnitude of her authority. Every person present recognized that a pivotal moment had occurred, one where quiet confidence, preparation, and knowledge had completely shifted the power dynamics in a formal, tense setting. The courtroom had witnessed not just a challenge to arrogance, but a subtle triumph of intellect, patience, and calm authority. The woman, through her strategic approach and unshakable composure, had transformed the situation into an unforgettable example of how respect and authority are earned, not assumed. The officer, now visibly unsettled, realized that he had underestimated her completely, and that lesson would stay with him long after the proceedings ended. The courtroom remained tense, the air thick with anticipation. Every eye was on the woman, and the officer, once brimming with arrogance, now appeared noticeably uneasy. His earlier confidence had vanished, replaced by a quiet panic that he struggled to hide. The people in the room could sense it. The shift in power was complete. For the first time in the proceedings, he realized that he had misjudged the situation entirely. He had assumed she was inexperienced, that she would be intimidated, and that her presence was negligible. He had been wrong on every count. The woman leaned slightly forward, her voice calm and measured. "Officer, it is essential that we maintain clarity. Every detail matters. Please provide the exact sequence of events as you remember them, including the instructions you received and the times they were given." She spoke without accusation, without frustration, but each word carried authority. Her presence alone demanded attention. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of papers shuffling as he tried to gather his thoughts. He hesitated, flipping through his notes nervously. His earlier ease had evaporated, and now he was careful, almost hesitant as he began to recount the events. Every sentence he spoke was tentative, a stark contrast to the confident statements he had made earlier. The audience noticed the change immediately. Some whispered softly to each other, sharing their surprise at the dramatic turn of events. Others simply leaned forward, captivated by the unfolding scene. The woman continued asking questions that required precise answers. She pointed out inconsistencies with calm, quiet authority, making it impossible for him to respond with vague statements or deflection. "You mentioned that the witness was present," she said gently. "Yet your report indicates otherwise. Can you explain this difference?" Her tone was steady and her eyes never wavered from his. The officer shuffled papers, glanced at the judge, and hesitated before answering, his voice lacking the certainty it once carried. The courtroom had become a study in contrasts. On one side was the officer, flustered, uncomfortable, and clearly aware of the authority the woman held. On the other side was the woman, calm, composed, and methodical, exposing the flaws in his testimony without ever raising her voice or appearing aggressive. The people watching were captivated by her poise. It was clear to everyone that she had mastered the art of control, not through intimidation, but through intelligence, patience, and confidence. He tried to speak, attempting to regain some semblance of authority, but every attempt fell flat. The more he tried to assert dominance, the more obvious it became that he was outmatched. The courtroom, once uncertain of her role, now recognized her competence and her authority. Even the judge, who had remained mostly silent, observed with a quiet appreciation for her skillful handling of the proceedings. She continued her questioning, moving carefully through each point of contention. Her goal was not to humiliate him, but to ensure the truth was clear, to clarify every detail for the record. "Let's go step by step," she said, her voice calm. "Please recount the events exactly as they happened, without assumptions or additions. Accuracy is important for everyone involved." The officer nodded nervously, knowing that any misstep could further undermine his credibility. As he recounted the sequence of events, she interrupted occasionally with clarifying questions, each designed to focus on the facts and reveal any inconsistencies. Her questions were precise, measured, and deliberate, making it impossible for him to rely on generalities or evasive answers. The courtroom watched in silence, noticing how the balance of power had completely shifted. The officer, who had mocked her earlier, was now visibly struggling to maintain his composure. Her calm authority had a ripple effect. Spectators, who had been uncertain of her presence, began to feel a sense of respect and admiration. People were noticing the patience and thoughtfulness behind her approach. She had not needed to shout or belittle. Her quiet confidence and mastery of the facts had established her credibility far more effectively than aggression ever could. The officer's earlier bluster seemed almost childish in comparison, highlighting the stark contrast between arrogance and composed competence. The woman pressed further, ensuring that every detail was examined. She asked about the timing of actions, the instructions received, and the communication between different parties involved. Each question revealed a subtle discrepancy, a gap in memory or an assumption the officer had made. He stumbled slightly with each answer, aware that the courtroom was observing not just what he said, but how he said it. Every hesitation, every faltering word was a reminder of the power she now held. Even the jury, if there were one, leaned forward slightly, following her methodical approach. They were witnessing a lesson in authority and credibility. The officer, who had relied on charm and bravado to carry him, was now facing the undeniable fact that intelligence, preparation, and patience carried far more weight than confidence alone. His attempts to regain control were awkward, revealing his earlier misjudgment of her entirely. At one point, she paused and allowed a brief silence to settle over the room. It was a strategic pause, giving him time to reflect and gather his thoughts, but it also reinforced her control. Silence, she knew, could be as powerful as words. The courtroom felt the tension, and every spectator could sense the shift. The officer was trapped in a corner of his own making, and it was clear that he understood this. The woman continued, now moving to address the implications of the inconsistencies she had identified. She did so without accusation or anger, but with calm authority that demanded attention. Accuracy is not just about memory, she said. It is about responsibility. Every action taken by those in positions of authority must be documented clearly. Any lapse, even small, can have significant consequences. Her words were simple, but they carried weight because she spoke them with quiet confidence and clarity. The officer tried to interject, but she held up a hand politely, signaling that she would allow him to respond at the appropriate moment. Her ability to control the flow of the conversation without aggression was remarkable. The courtroom recognized it instinctively, understanding that she was leading the proceedings through intelligence and precision rather than dominance or loudness. He realized, slowly and painfully, that he could not outmaneuver her. She continued her methodical questioning, focusing on clarity and fact. Each point she raised further revealed the inconsistencies in his testimony. Her calm demeanor made it impossible for him to respond defensively without appearing even more unprepared. The courtroom observed this quietly but intently, captivated by the transformation in the dynamic. The officer, who had once seemed untouchable, now appeared small and uncertain. The audience began to whisper softly among themselves, impressed by her composure and skill. They noticed how she had turned a situation that began with mockery into one where she commanded respect effortlessly. She had not raised her voice, she had not made personal attacks, but she had demonstrated authority in the most effective way possible, through patience, knowledge, and precision. Even the judge, who had remained neutral and professional throughout, acknowledged the shift subtly. A slight nod, a raised eyebrow, a quiet adjustment of papers, small gestures that confirmed the woman's effectiveness. She had established control without confrontation, proving that authority and credibility could not be assumed but must be earned. The officer, meanwhile, grew increasingly tense. His attempts to regain dominance were awkward and ineffective. He had misjudged the situation entirely, believing that his rank and confidence would suffice. Now, under the woman's calm scrutiny, he realized that he had underestimated both her and the power of preparation, patience, and precision. She continued her questioning, ensuring that every detail of the events was examined. Her calm authority forced him to